as we read today, I want you to think about in Kensuke's kingdom how Michael and Kensuke's relationship has really changed since the beginning of, not necessarily the beginning of the story, but the beginning of when they met. What they used to be like and what they are like now. All right. Our life together was always busy and regular as clockwork. Up at dawn and down the track a little way to bathe in the stream where it tumbled cold and fresh out of the hillside into a great cauldron of smooth rocks. We would wash our sheets and clothes here too. He'd made me my own kimono by now, slapping and pounding them on the rocks before hanging them out to dry on the branch of a nearby tree. Breakfast was a thick, pulpy fruit juice that seemed different every day, and bananas or coconut. I never tired of bananas, but very soon became sick of coconut. The mornings were spent either fishing in the shallows or fruit gathering in the forest. Sometimes, after a storm, we scoured the beach for more of his painting shells. Only the biggest and flattest would do, or the flotsam to join the stack of wood at the back of the cave. There were two stacks, one clearly for firewood, the other, I supposed, reserved for his woodworking. Then it was home to the cave house for a lunch of raw fish, always delicious, and usually breadfruit, always bland and difficult to swallow, a short nap after lunch for both of us, and then he would settle down at his table and paint. As I watched him, I became so engrossed that the failing light of the evening always came too soon for me. We would cook a fish soup over the fire. Everything went in, heads and tails. Kensuke wasted nothing. A dozen different herbs, and there were always red bananas afterward. All I could eat. I never went hungry. When supper was over, we would sit together at the mouth of the cave and watch the last of the sun drop into the sea. And then, without a word, he'd stand up, and we would bow solemnly to each other, and he would unroll his sleeping mat and leave me to mine. To see Kensuke at his work was always a wonder to me. He was so intent, so concentrated in everything he did, but watching him paint was best of all. To begin with, he would only let me kneel beside him and watch. I could sense that in this too, he liked his privacy, that he did not want to be disturbed. On the table in front of him, he put the three saucers, one saucer of octopus ink. For Kensuke, octopuses were not just for eating. One sauce of water, and another for mixing. He always held his breath very upright and very steady in his hand, fingers down one side, thumb in the other. He would kneel bent over his work, his beard almost touching the shell he was painting. I think perhaps he was a little nearsighted. I would watch him for hours on end, marveling at the delicacy of his work, at the sureness of his touch. And then, one rainy afternoon, and when it rained how it rained, I found he'd set out a shell for me, my own three saucers, and my own paintbrush. He took such delight in teaching me, in every clumsy attempt. I remember early on I tried to paint the jellyfish that had attacked me. He laughed out loud at that, but not in a mocking way, rather in recognition, in memory of what had actually brought us together. I'd always liked to draw, but from Kensuke I learned to love it. That to draw or paint I first had to observe well, and then set out a form of the picture in my head and send it down my arm through the tip of the brush and onto the shell. He taught me all this entirely without speaking. He simply showed me. The evidence that was considerable craftsman was all around me. The cave house must have been entirely furnished by him, fashioned mostly from flotsam. The chest, the workbench itself, the shelves, the table. He must have made the rush matting, the bamboo paneling, everything. And on close examination I could see it was all perfectly finished. No nails, no screws, just neat doweling. He had used some form of glue where necessary, and sometimes twine as well. Ropes for tree climbing, fishing spears, fishing nets, and fishing rods were stacked in one corner, though I'd never yet seen him use the rods. He had to have made them all. He'd made his own paintbrushes as well. I was soon to find out how. Kensuke had a favorite orangutan, a large female called Tomodachi, who would often come and sit by him to be groomed. Kensuke was grooming her one day just outside the mouth of the cave house, the other orangutans looking on, when I saw him quite deliberately pluck out the longest and darkest hairs from her back. He held them up to show me, grinning conspiratorially. At the time, I didn't really understand what he was up to. Later, I watched him work at his bench, trimming the hairs with his knife, dipping them in sap. I'd seen him tap from a tree in that same morning, cutting out a short length of hollow bamboo and then filling it with Tomodachi's hair. And a day later, the glue had hardened and he had a paintbrush. Kensuke seemed to have found ways to satisfy his every need. We were silent at our painting one day. The rain thundering down from the forest below. When he stopped, put down his paintbrush, and said very slowly, in a measured way, as if he'd thought about how to say it for a long time, "I teach you painting, Micah?" And this was the first time he ever called me by my name. "You teach me speak English. I want to speak English. You teach me." It was the beginning of an English lesson that was to last for months, every day, dawn to dusk. I translated the world around him into English. He did what he had always done, but now I talked all the while, and he would echo every word, every phrase he wanted to. His brow would furrow with the effort of it. It was as if by saying each word he simply swallowed it into his brain, once told, once practiced, and he would rarely forget. And if he did, he was always very annoyed with himself. Sometimes, as I enunciated a new word, I noticed that his eyes would light up. He would be nodding and smiling, almost as if he recognized the word, as if it was greeting an old friend. He would repeat it again and again, savoring the sound of it before committing it to memory for good. And of course, some more words he knew. The more he tried to experiment with them, single words became clipped phrases, became entire sentences. His pronunciation, though, never did improve, however hard he tried. Michael was always Micah, sometimes Micah-san. Now, at last, we would talk more easily to each other. The long silence in which our friendship had been forged was over. It had never been a barrier between us, but it had been limiting. We were sitting by the cave mouth one sunset when he said, You see now if I understand, Micah-san. You tell me story of you, where you live, why you come here, my island, from baby to now. I listen." So I did. I told him about home, about my mother, my father, about the brick factory closing, about soccer with Eddie and the Mudlarks, about the Peggy Sue and our voyage around the world, about soccer in Brazil and lions in Africa and spiders in Australia, about my mother being ill, about the night I fell overboard. "Very good. I understand. Very good," he said when I had finished. "So, soccer you like?" "When I little, I play soccer too. Very happy time. Long ago now, in Japan, in my home." He sat in silence for some moments. "You very long way from home, Micah-san. You very sad sometimes. I see. So I make you happy. Tomorrow we go fishing. And maybe I tell you my story too. My story, your story, maybe same story now." The sun had suddenly gone. We stood up and bowed to each other. "Oyasumi nase," he said. "Good night," I said. It was the only time of the day he ever spoke in Japanese, though he did sing in Japanese mostly. I had taught him 10 green bottles, which always made him laugh when he sang it. I loved his laugh. It was never loud, more of a prolonged chuckle, but it always warmed my heart. The next morning, he picked up 2 of his fishing rods and a net and led the way into the forest. "Today we catch big fish, Micah, not small fish," he announced. He was taking us to the part of the island where I had been washed up all those months before, but rarely had cause to visit because there was little or no fruit to be found there. We had to beat the difficult path through the forest before joining a cliff that wound its way down to the hidden sandy bay. As we emerged from the forest onto the beach, Stella ran off, bounding at once into the shallows, barking at me to play with her. And suddenly, Kensuke caught me by the arm. "You look, Micah-san. What you see?" His eyes were full of mischief. I didn't know what I was supposed to be looking for. "Nothing here, yes?" "Aye, very clever fellow. You watch, I show you." He made for the end of the beach, and I followed. Once there, he began to pull and tug at the undergrowth, and to my surprise, it simply came away in his hands. I saw first what looked like a log lying in the sand, but then he dragged away more branches. I saw it as part of a boat, an outrigger, a long, wide dugout with a frame of outriggers on either side. It was covered in canvas, which he folded back very slowly, chuckling to himself when he did so. And there, lying in the bottom of the boat, beside a long oar, was my soccer ball. He reached in and tossed it to me. It was softer now, and much of the white leather was cracked and discolored, but in places I could still just make out Eddie's name. Okay, and that's where we'll end today. And then tomorrow, we will be able to hear Kensuke's story.